For the social sciences for this region module, we're going to move a little bit past some of the stuff we've talked about before. Up until now, we've been talking about empiricism as a way to describe conditions, and then we've been talking about different types of empirical evidence. But of course, empirical evidence is much more important than just this sort of basic descriptive function. We look at empirical evidence also to try to find answers, to explain things, to try to develop theories so that we can ultimately solve problems. And so that's what we're going to look at today. And the assignment that you have is related to that in the social science thinking assignment for this region module. The first thing to note is that theories in science are always based upon empirical data. And to move from empirical data into an explanatory theory is actually a very long process, and something that we won't be exploring in any depth in this course, but you should know that that process is extremely important. All scientific theory is rooted in empiricism, or it's not good scientific theory. There's a methodology that allows scientists to go from all those empirical pieces of evidence to broader theories, but it takes many, many studies, and oftentimes years, if not decades, to develop a theory. It's important to note that there's a big difference between a scientific theory and the notion of a theory that we have sort of in colloquial communication when we say, I have a theory that, and then we really are espousing more of our opinion about the world or some anecdote about the world than basing it on that systematic empirical knowledge that we know is important in any particular field. Geography, of course, has a number of different theories, and you've already been exposed to a couple of those. These include some theories of development, the demographic transition theory, the migration theory, which we talked about in Europe and Russia, and core periphery, which we just did in this particular lecture cycle. And of course, there are many other theories as well in the field of geography, not all of which we're going to get to in an introductory course. Now, the first step in working towards something really big and explanatory like a theory is just finding relationships between different types of information, different types of empirical data out there. These are the first baby steps in science, and they're the steps that every scientist has to do in order to ultimately develop something bigger, some broader theory, to uncover new knowledge. The first thing that generally a scientist does is hypothesize about a relationship between one aspect of the world and another. And in the case of the social sciences, and in the case of geography and the studies of development, like we're talking about right now, it's usually different aspects of development that might be related to one another. Now, in the social sciences, because humanity is very complex, we usually have variables that stand in for really broad factors. So if we want to understand the relationship between development on the one hand and fertility on the other, like we did when we were in Europe and Russia and talking about the demographic transition, we'd actually be looking instead for finding a relationship between something like the Human Development Index on the one hand and the total fertility rate on the other. Now, once we start getting into a relationship and looking to see if in fact an increase in human development leads to a decrease in total fertility, what we have proven is that there's a relationship between these two things. And a relationship doesn't mean that causation has taken place. Trying to demonstrate causation can be a very complicated thing, and again, is outside of the scope of Geography 101. But the theories that we have been introduced to are theories that, in fact, do argue for broader causal relationships than what we're able to do in a Geography 101 course. Generally, to demonstrate causation, it requires large numbers of empirical studies, the refinement of different types of theories to understand what exactly is happening in relationships. And they can be very difficult to prove. Ultimately, though, they're dependent on the development of theories that help us to demonstrate that causation. Now, if we were really looking for relationships and trying to see if there were relationships between two aspects of development, we would also be required in the social sciences to use rigorous statistical methods that would help us to demonstrate these relationships. When you start using certain kinds of statistical methodology, you're able to demonstrate quite clearly that within a range of certainty, or what's often known as significance, we can find a relationship between two variables and show that they're correlated. That still doesn't demonstrate causation. It may just show that there's a strong correlation between two variables. We might need to look again and again at other factors to determine if there is some sort of causal relationship there. Now, the use of these statistical methods and the search for causation, again, outside the scope of Geography International Studies 101. So for the purposes of the assignment, I really just want you to look for very basic relationships. To conclude, I just want to reiterate, and I suppose that's a pun, that science is very iterative in nature. It uses empiricism to describe the world, and then it uses empiricism to search for relationships. After relationships have been found, it uses empiricism to build theories that have been based on those earlier studies. And eventually, once a theory is developed, empiricism helps scientists to refine and even contradict theories that they've created so that the process can begin again. In this course, we use those big theories, but those theories have been developed by scientists through many, many studies, something much bigger than we're able to do in this course. But what I do want you to do in the assignment for this region module is to look for a relationship between two variables that are likely related, and in fact may even have some sort of causal relationship, though you won't be able to demonstrate it today.